Hello, and welcome to All Charged Up, the podcast that brings state, county, and local municipality resources together with industry experts as we discuss a variety of topics, such as EV infrastructure, renewables, and the electrical contracting industry in DuPage. I'm your host, Karyn Charvat, and in today's episode, we will be talking about multifamily dwelling charging issues and increasing access to public EV charging with Tim Milburn of Greenways to Go. Tim, hello, and welcome back to All Charged Up.
Hi, Karyn. Good morning. Glad to be back. Great to be back.
Wonderful. And we're here again at the beautiful College of DuPage Multimedia Center. Shout out to them. They do a wonderful job for us. Tim, on our first episode, we had talked at length about what is currently happening really on a broad level in terms of EV infrastructure. And we did touch upon the basics of residential charging, but more from a single-family home perspective. What about those folks living in apartments or condos? I have to think that there is, quite a number of challenges for them.
Indeed. So I kind of deal with the whole spectrum, and which includes single-family, multifamily, commercial, along the highways. And I find the multifamily dwelling challenging maybe the most because it's complicated. There's a number of different ways that people do live in multifamily dwellings. Mm-hmm. And just as an example, 60% of people in the city of Chicago live in multifamily dwellings. And
60%? Well, yeah, I guess it does make sense.
And out in the collar counties, it's 20 to 30%. So it's a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And we need to get them driving EVs. How do we do that? Do they use public charging or where they live? Right. And the challenge is it typically boils down to there's the kind of differences whether you live in an apartment where somebody else owns the parking in your home, or a condominium where you own it and you may or may not own the parking space. So that determines basically the type of charging device that you would put in. Mm-hmm. If you, like an apartment building, you could actually share because an owner of the building could put in a charging station that can be shared by any number of users. Whereas if you had, for example, a deeded space in a condominium, we typically say you have to have a dedicated charger, and the resident who owns title to that parking space also will own the charger and pay for the charger.
Sure, and I can imagine that that's the sharing. Well, if you go back to the sharing aspect, maybe more in the apartment, example, right? That really sort of leads itself to potential inconveniences and conflicts of when are people trying to charge, and if there's only a handful of spots.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about the charging is as it's evolved, especially with the shared ones, is they're smart devices in that they will tell the current person charging when they're done, and it'll send an email to somebody waiting.
Oh, there you
go. So you can have multiple users in a given living complex that can share. It's not perfect, and at some point you might need to put in a second one or a third one as more people get EVs. But basically the technology is advanced so that you can manage that as well as reasonably expected. And the other thing, just if you're charging, these are all level 2 chargers, which are 240 volts. Typically you're dealing with a level that will give you about 25 miles per hour of recharge. So a couple hours, it's 50 miles. That usually fills most people up. So you don't need to stay there for a long time unless you've taken a long trip or something. But
sure,
basically that allows a lot of people to use it in a given day, typically.
Mm-hmm. And again, one of the reasons why we're even having this conversation is again because of this having 1 million EVs on the road by 2030, and folks like you and I who are living and breathing this every day, we see the days and the weeks and the months ticking by, and we're, really knocking on 2024 here. So these are the types of things that really need to, no pun intended, but get up to speed, right? And making sure that there's access for folks.
Yeah, so this is, it's the chicken and egg or the field of dreams concept.
Yeah.
So people don't get EVs, especially in multifamily living, because they don't have charging at home, and they don't put charging at home because nobody has EVs. But if the facilities could put it in, people would get EVs. And I hear this all the time from HOA boards or people who own apartment buildings. And a lot of that has to date been driven largely by incentives or lack of incentives. So if you think about to put in one charging circuit in a multifamily dwelling, it's say anywhere between $3,000 and $6,000 just to put in the infrastructure, and then maybe another $3,000 or $4,000 for the charging circuit. So it's a lot of money. And the building, do they want to front all that, or do they just want to put it on the resident? In the case of a condominium, or some mix of it. And the state of Illinois and the federal government has been talking about providing some of that funding for some time now, and it's soon to be released.
Okay.
I'll be having it on good word, probably at the beginning of next year, 2024, which means these larger condos and apartments will say, hey, this is the time to do this, at which point people will buy the EVs and it'll be able to get the infrastructure in. Because it's, when I say infrastructure, it's all the conduit wiring and new panels and power transformers and other stuff that adds up that a building can't really justify, especially for the residents who don't drive EVs.
Well, sure. And I would also imagine, right, just like anything else, they have to probably, survey the residents who even right now at this moment in time, is driving an EV or who's planning to purchase one in the next, 3, 6, 9 months, right? All that has to take place.
We look at it as you have to balance supply and demand.
Right.
So we go out and we work with our clients we do surveys, as you just brought up, to find out, if we put in the charging infrastructure, would you buy an EV? That's the fundamental question.
Right.
Exactly. So, and I've been doing this for 10 years, and it used to be no, just nobody was going to do it. And I was at a place last week, and out of 100, there were 40 people interested.
Really?
Kind of and I had another building that was similar in terms of percentage of residents. It used to be a few people, so that number is growing. People see the writing on the walls with respect to the cars, but they've got to figure out how to solve the charging at home. So that says there's this demand that's growing. So now you have to look at the supply side, and a building will typically have some spare capacity in their panels. And so what we'll do is figure out how much you have and then compare the two. And at some point you may have to call ComEd and get more power brought in, but in many cases you don't need to do that for some time. And anyway, those are the steps we take. And when you figure that all out, then it's how much and when, and you can do these things in stages, and that's the kind of thing we will do for a given facility.
And I can only imagine part of the challenge, one of the challenges I should say, is really retrofitting older buildings that, this was just never even a consideration in 1960 when the building, or even older, right? Because we're talking, some buildings, especially in the city and in some of the Oak Park areas, we're talking about 100-year-old buildings, right? That's got to be quite an undertaking.
The older, probably the less spare power, not necessarily a rule, but also some of these buildings may have already gone through other iterations over time where they had to increase their service, their electrical power. In many cases they haven't, and so they've got to get ComEd. We're actually doing one in Oak Park where we're going to be adding a certain amount of power, and that's a fairly straightforward process. Costs money, but it's it can be done. There are some other things in old buildings because, you're poking holes in walls. You may have to do some other things to retrofit, going through ceilings and floors. But, those are things that all can be done.
Sure. And again, I think I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this, but, when you talk about regulatory code and all those things, they can prevent, or not really prevent, but can present more challenges down the road, right?
Right. Yeah. And sometimes if you're doing retrofitting and you do a certain amount of work, you have to meet the newer codes.
Exactly.
Kind of restating what you said. And sometimes that's opening up a bit of a can of worms that might want to be avoided. So, but typically it's all solvable. It's just a question of cost.
Tim, a moment ago we talked about incentives or the lack of incentives. Let's go and, if we could, dive into what current incentives actually are out there to help building owners and property managers at this time.
So the incentives break down into where you live, where you work, where you drive.
Okay.
And then also, I'll just say fleets as a general group. So it could be municipal
Fleets is a whole nother thing. We could tackle that in another episode, right? For sure.
So if we talk about where you live, if you're living in a multifamily dwelling, so now you can either charge where you live or charge near where you live, or charge when you're at work or charge when you're on the road. So if we stick to where you live, the incentives so far have been not great in Illinois, but that's changing. So ComEd's got an incentive now where they're going to be offering up to $5,300 per parking space starting next year. And it's an EV rate program that they're organizing. The details aren't out yet. It's up to $5,300, so I don't know what that is. They have a focus on lower income. They also are going to be offering some rebates on vehicles. State of Illinois is responsible for putting in some of the, if you will, the local charging, level 2 and DC fast charging.
Sure.
So they're going to be, if you will, filling the corner stores. And then the federal government has their national program where they're putting in 3 high-powered DC fast chargers every 50 miles on all the interstates. And they've got a kind of a sister program, which is called community charging, where they're going to be on major highways. They'll do something similar, putting in charging, so that we're basically building this network of ubiquity of charging to remove range anxiety for the EV driver.
Yes.
And also some of these will fill in to these areas proximal to multifamily dwellings so that people who live in them will be able to avail themselves of those chargers. And one other thing, just kind of put it in perspective, most people drive like 30 to 40 miles a day. That's the average, like 80%. That's depending on the charger, that's an hour to 2 of plugging in time. So it's not forever. You can get there and get your vehicle back. Somebody else can take the charger over. It doesn't have to be in your building, or you can do that in your building if you can get that.
And that kind of just brings up just another topic in terms of, equitable access, right, to EV charging, making sure that it's really, accessible, for everyone, regardless of their, mobility needs or financial, status, right? And that sort of gets all wrapped up into this conversation as well in terms of the programs that are becoming available to help with that, right?
If you look at a map of chargers today, they talk about charging deserts.
Okay.
Which is basically a lot of times it's low-income neighborhood.
Okay.
Or communities of color. So one of the focuses of the federal programs in particular is to fill those gaps.
Sure.
Is to get chargers located in those areas. There's also incentives on used EVs. So for low income, maybe used EVs work out better than new EVs. But you can also get up to $11,500 in incentives on a new EV right now in Illinois. So so you could buy a new car and take that off of the price tag. That makes it more affordable.
It sure does.
So that's focusing on, if you will, the lower income section. And we're also filling in the gaps with these other programs for the chargers themselves. Regarding accessibility from a mobility standpoint, the ADA has written some rules. Americans for Disability Act has written some rules that we hope to see implemented that are very specific to parking design, with being able to get around the vehicle.
Oh, sure.
Some specific things that, where the plug is so handicapped people can get to it, things like that. So those rules they're loosely in place. They haven't been formalized at the federal or state level, but I think they will soon. In the meantime, it's kind of best practice, and that's already recognized as a need in terms of how you design a parking lot.
Right. And that kind of brings it back a little bit full circle. When we first started to talk, you had kind of talked about, when you come on site and your steps. Some of the other things I think that have to be taken into consideration by the property management, property owners, and in these HOAs is all of the factors that go into this, including, right, retrofitting, but then the maintenance of the charging stations, and who bears that responsibility? I just think that every time you kind of start to look at this topic and you peel back a little bit, there's just another layer to peel back. And it's why one of the reasons why I love this topic. And I really hope that people are starting to really educate themselves so that they can really serve, the population of their building the right way. Yeah.
Right. So there are vendors out there that provide excellent aftermarket programs for maintaining. You can get people who come out regularly on contract. You have, most of them will do phone calls and they'll get a guy out there 24/7 to.
The good ones do.
Yeah, the good ones. Yeah. They're not all like that. Yeah.
I know, Tim.
So at any rate, those are programs for somebody thinking of purchasing an EV charging station they should pay attention to at the end of the day. Find out what that is. Obviously, there's a cost, but it's a good investment. But it's like buying anything, a refrigerator or a dishwasher, if you will. It's something that probably is going to last a good long time. But, this warranty is covering that risk.
Sure. And
you can get extended warranties and things of that sort. You can get parts and labor. So there's a mix of things that you pay for. Anyway, the good vendors offer some nice programs.
Excellent. Let's touch upon really quickly, how, we're talking about all of the challenges because of the, the availability of condos and apartment buildings that we have now, right, that are already in existence and have been here decades. But what's in place to make sure that going forward, everybody's like sort of on the right side of this with, maybe new construction, let's say?
So there's a group called the International Code Council, ICC, which anybody in municipality is familiar with. They kind of are the writers of most codes, building codes, electrical code. Well, not electrical codes, that's National Electrical Code. But at any rate, they have something called the International Energy Conservation Code, IECC. And part of the new version of that relates to EVs. And so they are laying down some new ideas so that when you build a new building, that you include provisions for EV charging, whether it's just to provide the conduits, which they call EV capable, or EV ready, where you put the wires and the breakers in, or EVSE installed is the third one, where we actually provide a charger, EVSE, electric vehicle supply equipment.
I love it. So they're getting out in front of it then.
Exactly.
Perfect.
In Illinois, they passed something called the EV Charging Act this summer, which goes into effect January 1st. Which says if you're building a new single-family home, you have to put an EV charging conduit into the garage, into the parking area that runs to a panel that has the capacity. You don't have to put the cables in, but it's called EV capable. And the same thing is true for a multifamily dwelling. So you have to provide the conduits to go out to the parking areas for 100% of the spaces.
Yeah. Yep.
And there's also something called the EV owner's rights, which is part of this, which if you live in a multifamily dwelling starting in January.
You have the right to charge.
You have the right to charge. That doesn't mean you don't pay for it, but an HOA or apartment owner can't say no.
Right. And I just think that that will be interesting. It makes, it makes a lot of sense, right, to try and combat some of these challenges and these issues. But at the same time, I see where it could probably bring up a lot of challenges and issues. So we'll stay tuned, right?
It's going to be interesting.
It's going to be interesting. And we will probably tackle that after the new year. Well, good. I really appreciate your insight and, of course, everything that you bring to the table when we sit down and have these conversations, Tim. One thing I'd like to maybe end with is where we kind of started. We've got someone listening that, owns an apartment building or perhaps is on a board of their local homeowners association. What steps really should they take if they're looking to start this process?
That's
really for their residents.
That's a great way of wrapping up. One is call me.
Call me. I like that one. No, that's usually mine. That's usually what I say, Tim, but you could say it.
The first step is to get somebody who knows, can ask the right questions,
of course,
and give direction. That's kind of what we do, is to find out. It's kind of what I started taking. What kind of parking? What kind of ownership of the parking and the building itself? What kind of power capacity? And then I often will end up leaving a survey behind so they can find out where the residents are. At that point, they've got the foundations for making decisions.
Yeah, and that's green ways to go, folks. Green ways to go. But
Anyways, that's fundamentally it. Just get started. And one other thing to just tag on to that is
Sure.
because these incentives are going to come and go, it behooves buildings to have at least a sketch of a plan, if not a plan, in place so that when the monies come, they can apply.
Right, or start these conversations with their board now.
Yeah.
Because again, I would imagine in that type of scenario, everybody, again, no pun, they all have to be on board. They have to vote on these things before they can even, probably reach out and make appointments and things like that.
Yep.
But there's definitely a lot that goes into this, and we really appreciate, again, everything that you bring to us, and thank you again for sitting down with us. We really appreciate it. And just to wrap up, everyone, I want to say thanks again to the gracious in-studio production team here at College of DuPage. It is such a top-notch facility, so thank you all. And Tim, thank you very much. We appreciate you.
Thank you, Karyn. My pleasure.
You've been listening to All Charged Up with me, Karyn Charvat of Power Forward DuPage. Power Forward DuPage represents over 300 of the most highly sought-after electrical contractors in the Chicagoland area. We support the electrical contracting industry here in DuPage County, Illinois, and act as a resource for its municipalities, businesses, and residents. Find us at powerforwarddupage.com, and until next time, keep powering through.